Hey everybody, this is Mr. Mobbin coming at you with another APUSH video. This is our second video focusing in on topic 6.4, taking a look at the American South in the late 1800s. Previously we talked about how the New South was coming to define itself as a more modern, economic, region in terms of embracing industrialization more than it used to embracing modern infrastructure like it used to. But there's also going to be, of course, issues dealing with race and social matters that we have to take a look at. Now, of course, matters of race and social issues have been obviously the center of a lot of important events taking place in the South in the previous, 20 years. We know that the Civil War goes from being a war to keep the Union together to being a war to destroy slavery, which was not just an economic necessity in the minds of white Southerners, but it was also an integral part of defining the social relationships in the South as well. The idea being is that if you are white, that makes you inherently superior to somebody that is black. And now, with the war being over, slavery now abolished, the question then became, of course, of, what rights, what opportunities socially will blacks now have in the post-Civil War era? And we know that during Reconstruction, there was a very, very strong attempt by Republicans in Congress to really change the social structure regarding race, because it wasn't just simply the abolition of slavery. It was the granting of citizenship under the 14th Amendment. It was the ability of protecting due process under law at the state level via the 14th Amendment, and the right to vote under the 15th Amendment. But also, though, a number of civil rights laws that were passed in 1866 and 1875 that would basically ban, for lack of a better term, public discrimination based on race. And we see during the Reconstruction period of the late 1860s into the first half of the 1870s, black Americans gaining tremendous new opportunities. And of course, we saw that result in black Americans voting in massive numbers, black Americans getting elected to all sorts of positions, ranging from local county commissioners all the way to becoming U.S. senators. And so it seemed during that little bubble of time during Reconstruction that the social hierarchy in the South based on race is going to be permanently changed. But unfortunately, it didn't really quite work out that way. Remember, what was holding all this together in terms of allowing these racial, social changes to take place was basically federal troops. That the racial opportunities were basically being protected by the end of bayonet points. But with the election of 1876, the Compromise of 1877, which gave the Republicans control of the White House, but in exchange, federal troops being pulled out of the South, those protections are no longer going to be available. And so you're going to start to see a very, very quick reversal of the opportunities that blacks are going to have, particularly from a political perspective. You're going to see whites in the Democratic Party quickly take control of the political institutions in the various southern states. This is going to be known as the Redeemer movement. And with that taking place, you're now going to be seeing the institution of entrenched, and not just by culture or tradition, but by law, public segregation and discrimination. This is going to be commonly known as Jim Crow laws. Now, first, let me make something very, very clear. Do not take the idea that segregation by law in the South is going to mean that only the South had racial segregation, discrimination. That's totally false. That was a national thing that existed. You could be living in New York or Michigan or Nebraska or California. There was racial discrimination everywhere. What made the South different, though, was that unlike other parts of America where that was done by tradition, it was done with a wink and a nod and an understanding, in the South, this was actually codified by law. So in other words, if you did not adhere to these segregated rules, it wasn't just a matter that you were frowned upon socially, it was actually criminal in nature. So that's going to be, excuse me, the notable distinction between these segregation rules and customs, so to speak. Now, we've mentioned previously that one of the key limitations to what Republicans in Congress are trying to do with regards to race and providing real opportunities for Black Americans is the fact that even though Congress was working to help Black Americans, the Supreme Court was not. We know through a number of civil rights cases that are going to be taking place, the guts of the Civil Rights Acts of 1866 and 1875 are going to be taken out. Basically, they're going to be able to really, really narrowly define what is protected under the 14th Amendment in terms of equal protection of the law and due process and things like that, that basically are going to allow a lot of discrimination regarding race. And this is going to culminate in the infamous 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson case, which was focusing in on a man named Homer Plessy, who was multiracial, living in Louisiana. Now, if you were, biracial by basically every standard of the day, any drop of anything ethnically that was not 100% white meant that you weren't white. So in the case of Homer Plessy, he had one African American great grandparent, but still that classified him as Black in Southern society, in the state of Louisiana specifically. And so that meant that he was required to use facilities only for African Americans. And note, what Jim Crow laws do is basically by law segregate every aspect of public life. From the churches you attended, to the schools you went to the sections of restaurants you ate in, to the sections of theaters that you attended, to who you could legally marry, even to the cemeteries you were buried in. Every aspect of life, and even into death, was segregated by law. And if you weren't 100% white, or perceived to be 100% white, then you were in African American, or as they used the term back then, colored sections of whatever facilities that we're talking about. Homer Plessy was going to be one of those folks that was a victim of that. He was forced to travel in the African American sections of rail cars in the South. Now, the argument being is that, if you are segregated by race, and we know that whites are in charge of things in society, and given the prevailing racism of the time, whites that were in charge of these institutions and facilities did not really make it a priority to make sure that facilities really were adequately taken care of. So if you were Black, you were allowed to ride in a rail car, but you were in a segregated rail car that was not nearly as nice or as well cleaned and taken care of as a white rail car. And that's going to be the beef of Homer Plessy. He's going to be saying that, hey, the 14th Amendment has equal protection of the law. That's in the 14th Amendment. And the idea being is, how can you segregate by race and allow for equal protection of the law? Well, the Supreme Court, and note, this was 9 white guys at the time, and once again, we talk about the Supreme Court was not very friendly with regards to the racial and social changes that had been going on in recent years, are going to side with the segregationists in that infamous sever but equal doctrine. The argument the Supreme Court basically makes is that as long as facilities are equal, in other words, if you have rail cars for Black riders as well as white riders, if you have restroom facilities for Black Americans, just, as you would for whites, and if you got schools for Black kids, just like you have schools for white kids, then you're not violating the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. And so this is a very myopic, a very short-sighted, narrow interpretation of what the 14th Amendment meant, because all it demanded was that on paper that things were equal. But we know that that was not going to be the case. We know that if you went to a white school, you had better teachers, better school buildings, better textbooks than kids that went to schools for Blacks. And if you were a Black student in one of these segregated schools, you were probably educated in a shack. with minimally educated teachers. And your new textbooks were probably the cast-offs of the textbooks from the white schools. And so, yeah, you're equal on paper, but not in reality. So that's going to be a significant problem. In addition to the institution of Jim Crow segregation protected by the Supreme Court, you also saw the attempt by whites in the South to utterly destroy political participation in this new post-Reconstruction South. And even though the Fifth Amendment guarantees the right to vote cannot be taken away on account of race or conditions of previous servitude, meaning that they can't keep you from being allowed to vote because you're black or because you used to be a slave, we're going to see white Southerners get very creative in their ways to manipulate rules to basically have the effect of keeping black Americans from being able to vote. And some of these are going to be very insidious. One of these examples will be literacy tests. You will see in many southern states rules be applied that you had to pass a quote-unquote literacy test to vote. On the surface, it was the idea being is that you need to have educated citizens to be able to, make effective decisions in terms of voting. But what commonly happened, though, is that these literacy tests are going to be intentionally used as a way to keep poor, uneducated people from being able to vote by making these tests very difficult. If you were someone that was black, you probably did not have much of a quality education. Many black Americans still were illiterate. And so having any kind of a challenging government citizenship exam is going to keep you from voting. So that was a very, very powerful way to keep blacks from being able to vote. Another way was poll taxes. The 15th Amendment doesn't say that you can't charge a tax to vote, and that's what poll taxes did. Poll taxes were designed as a way to keep poor people from participating in the electoral process. And the vast majority of black residents in the South were poor, very impoverished. So if you're charging someone $1 to vote at a time where $1 really meant something, that could be the difference between your family eating for the day and not, you're going to use that dollar to feed your family as opposed to vote. And that was by design, white Southern political leaders keeping blacks from being able to have the money to be able to vote. You also had what were called white primaries. Now, primaries are going to start to become more popular as we get into the 20th century. But basically the way it works is that in order to decide who gets on the general election ballot, in other words, who gets to be the Democrat nominee and who gets to be the Republican nominee, we start to see by the beginning of the 20th century the use of primaries. Primaries are votes made up of party members to decide, for example, which Democrat candidate gets to be their official nominee for an elected office race. Well, even though the 15th Amendment says that you can't be denied the right to vote, it's going to be applied to general election votes. So in other words, in the general election between the Democrat and the Republican, they couldn't deny the ability to vote based on race. But if you're talking about the primaries, the votes amongst Democrats to decide who gets to be the Democrat nominee, you could use race as a way to keep folks from participating. So you had white-only participatory primaries. You also had grandfather clauses early on in this time period. Grandfather clauses were implemented in states that basically stipulated that if you wanted to vote, you had to be able to prove that your grandfather was legally able to vote. Now, if you were white, that wasn't a problem. But if you were black, yeah, you used to be a slave, and the 15th Amendment protects you, but the grandfather clauses are saying that, well, could you prove that your grandfather was able to vote? Well, if you were black at this time period, almost certainly your grandfather was a slave. So it's denying you the right to vote, not because you were a slave, but because your grandfather was a slave. Very, very slick, very insidious, and effective, keeping blacks from voting. And notes. We also saw rules in the books that said that blacks could not serve on juries. That was, protected because of Supreme Court action. And notes. When you actually also add, beyond legal ways to try to keep blacks from voting, for example, the use of lynch mobs, the Ku Klux Klan, intimidation, physical intimidation, employers intimidating employees from voting if they're black. This is going to have a very, very important effect. We're going to see black participation almost completely evaporate. Blacks effectively cannot vote, cannot run for office. They're going to be completely locked out of the political process. We're even going to see black Americans facing segregation in terms of being able to get jobs in factories and in trade schools. So pretty horrific stuff. We'll see you next time.